What if your dream lake getaway turned into a battlefield against a clipboard-wielding tyrant hellbent on stealing your prized Mustang? One federal inspector's vacation becomes a masterclass in dismantling HOA madness. The first red flag was the 16-year-old boy in swim trunks and flip-flops pointing at my Mustang like he just spotted a UFO that owed him rent. "Hey, you can't park that here," he said, arms crossed like a traffic cop in training. "That car belongs to the HOA now." I thought he was joking, maybe even trolling, until he yanked out a clipboard from behind his back like some suburban bounty hunter and began scribbling something down under a column labeled asset seizures. It was 10:07 a.m. on a Saturday. We had just arrived at our family's lake cabin after a 5-hour drive, and my wife hadn't even finished unloading the cooler before we were hit with what felt like a parody of a parody. I blinked at the kid, then at the Mustang, then back at the kid, unsure if I was hallucinating, but then the crunch of hurried sandals against gravel drew our eyes upward, and there she came like a storm in khakis and sunglasses. Karen herself, marching down the slope of the trail from the HOA office with the fury of a bureaucrat who hadn't been told no since the Bush administration. Her sun hat was tilted at a heroic angle, her laminated lanyard swinging with every step like a sheriff badge at a spaghetti western cosplay. "You're violating several communal statutes," she snapped before I even said a word. "This land beside the cabin is considered transition turf. Vehicles parked here fall under temporary community stewardship." It was the kind of sentence that makes you pause and wonder if you're on a hidden camera show. My wife glanced at me with a look that meant either punch her or don't you dare. I chose neither. I turned to Karen slowly as if I were mentally translating her HOA gibberish into English. "You're saying my car," I said evenly, "is now community property because I parked it near a pine tree." Karen pulled a binder out from her tote bag. It had color-coded tabs and a custom-printed HOA logo featuring a seagull. "Page 14, she said proudly, flipping it open. Paragraph 3b. Anything placed on shared-use terrain may be subject to discretionary integration into the community." I nearly laughed, but my wife did instead, loud and uncontrolled. "Did you seriously write that yourself?" Karen's face turned a shade redder, like she wasn't used to being questioned by anyone who hadn't also bought into her propaganda. Bryce, the clipboard kid, was now hovering near the Mustang's hood, peering through the windshield like he expected to see the Holy Grail in the glove compartment. "Bryce," Karen called, "make a note that the vehicle may require asset stabilization if it remains after sundown." He nodded solemnly like he was writing a court order. I could feel something dark curling in the back of my throat. A boiling frustration that had nothing to do with the drive or the heat and everything to do with the utter absurdity of what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This was a setup. I looked around. Several cabin owners were standing further back, watching but not intervening. A few even looked nervous. One neighbor I recognized from last year gave me a tiny shrug that screamed, "Yeah, she's been like this all summer." So, this wasn't new. Karen had been running unchecked, emboldened by fear, silence, or just the illusion of authority. But I was not someone who reacted well to illusions. I gave my wife the universal look of "I got this," then walked calmly to the back of the Mustang, popped the trunk, and pulled out a small black case. Karen tensed, maybe thinking I was going to pull out a chainsaw or a protest sign. What I did pull out was my badge. I didn't wave it like a movie cop. I held it firmly in both hands and stepped forward so the light caught the emblem just right. It read Federal Inspector, Department of Financial Crimes. Karen blinked once, twice, and then stumbled backward like she'd seen a ghost holding a subpoena. "I suggest," I said clearly and without raising my voice, "you take your fake rulebook and your clipboard deputy here and walk away from my vehicle before this turns into something you can't backpedal out of." Bryce's mouth dropped open. Karen's hands trembled just slightly, like she was trying to decide between yelling or fainting. My wife leaned casually against the cooler and opened a soda. Her grin so wide it could have been sold as a national park. "Also," I added, "your transition turf is actually covered under our cabin's deed. You're standing on it. So, technically, you're trespassing." Karen's face was a war zone of emotions, panic, denial, anger, and a desperate attempt to salvage dignity. "We'll be reviewing this," she muttered, clutching her binder like it could save her soul. "This isn't over." She turned on her heel, called for Bryce, and stomped back up the trail. But I knew the moment her voice cracked, and she glanced at my badge a second time, that she had just realized she picked a fight with someone who not only knew the law, but had built cases against people far more sophisticated than a neighborhood tyrant with a seagull logo and delusions of governance. I hadn't come to the lake cabin looking for a battle, but it was clear one had been waiting. And if she thought this was over, she didn't know how deep I was willing to go to dismantle a kingdom built on threats, fake bylaws, and weaponized fine print. The Mustang purred quietly as I moved it slightly farther into the driveway just to be safe. My wife patted the hood and whispered, "Not today, HOA." Little did we know then that this was just the beginning, because Karen wasn't alone. And her game was bigger, messier, and far more illegal than I could have imagined. But I'd already decided something important. If she wanted a war over a car, a cabin, and a patch of fake turf, I'd give her one she'd never forget. That night, the lake was calm, but my mind was buzzing with static. The kind of low-level tension that creeps in when you realize something that once seemed laughable is actually part of a much deeper rot. I couldn't sleep, and neither could my wife. Not because of the usual vacation excitement, but because both of us sensed that what happened earlier with Karen and her clipboard-wielding son wasn't a one-off. There was an order to the madness, a pattern to the behavior, and it felt too rehearsed to be spontaneous. Bryce had come out of nowhere with that ridiculous declaration about my Mustang belonging to the HOA like it was an official directive. Karen hadn't stuttered when quoting her fabricated bylaws. She wasn't guessing, she was executing. That was the word that stuck in my brain as I stared at the ceiling above our bed, the wooden fan spinning slowly overhead like the seconds ticking toward some inevitable escalation. By morning, I'd already drafted a mental checklist and pulled out a legal pad from my briefcase to start documenting everything. Step 1 was confirming that our cabin and the adjacent gravel space where I'd parked the car were in fact our property. I knew this already from the deed, but I wanted it in writing and ready to hand over if anyone tried anything again. I scanned and printed 3 copies, slid one under my Mustang's windshield wiper, and posted one on the side of the cabin window in a clear folder. My wife brewed coffee and flipped through the HOA welcome packet Karen had dropped off like a smug paper grenade the day before. It was a mess of made-up rules, contradictory phrasing, and laughable declarations like Rule 22 subsection D. No pine needles on roofs for more than 48 hours, and Rule 6 subsection B, communal ambience may override individual aesthetic choices during high-tra months. One page had the header asset stewardship zones with a chart that tried to divide the entire lakeside into overlapping color-coded regions. Ours was marked yellow. According to Karen, yellow meant temporarily accessible community buffer. According to logic and property law, yellow meant nothing. I scanned that packet, too, uploaded it to the drive I kept for investigations, and flagged everything that looked suspicious. The language wasn't just vague. It was purposefully constructed to give someone like Karen the illusion of legal authority. She'd taken pieces of real bylaws, twisted them, added fake citations, and printed them out on glossy paper like it would fool anyone who didn't know how to read contracts or municipal code. And unfortunately, it had fooled quite a few people. I could see it in the faces of our neighbors when Karen stormed off yesterday. Some were relieved, some looked nervous, most stayed quiet. Silence is where people like her thrive. After breakfast, I walked out to check the exterior cameras I'd installed last year around the cabin. Nothing fancy, just motion-activated HD cams tied to a local hard drive. My wife scrolled through the footage from the previous weekend, curious about whether Karen's behavior had been escalating gradually. And sure enough, it had. 2 nights before we arrived, at around 2:18 a.m., the footage showed Bryce walking up to the Mustang with a flashlight in his mouth, wearing gloves, and tugging at the driver's side door. He fumbled with something metal, likely a coat hanger or Slim Jim, and circled the car twice before a distant porch light came on and he bolted. The timestamp was crystal clear. My wife clipped the video and backed it up. "He's not just an idiot," she muttered. "He's a petty criminal in training." I wasn't surprised. I'd worked enough fraud cases to know that entitlement always starts small. Fake rules become fake fines. Fake fines become property seizures. Add a little fear, a little social pressure, and people stop resisting. They comply. That's how HOA tyrants win. Around noon, we found a note taped to our door, printed on HOA letterhead with an official-looking font and stamped in red. Violation notice. Unauthorized vehicle presence on shared transition turf. Fine. $750. Due within 72 hours to avoid lien escalation. It was signed by Karen with a flourish like she just sealed a royal decree. My wife laughed so hard she nearly dropped her sandwich. "This woman's delusional," she said, "but also kind of scary." I photographed the notice, filed it, and began drafting my own formal response. I wasn't going to send it yet, not until I had the rest of the picture. That afternoon, we invited over one of the quieter neighbors, a retired nurse named Sandra, who lived 3 cabins down. She hesitated at first, but eventually came over for iced tea on the porch. When I gently asked about Karen, she lowered her voice and said things had been escalating all summer. She rewrote the parking rules and threatened to tow my nephew's boat last month, Sandra whispered. Said it was blocking the HOA's visual harmony zone. She rolled her eyes. Then last week, she told old Mr. Dunner he couldn't put up his wind chimes because they created competitive sound pollution. He's hard of hearing and they help him relax. I couldn't help but smile despite the absurdity. Karen wasn't just power hungry. She was inventing authority out of thin air. Has anyone ever pushed back? I asked. Sandra shook her head. A few tried, but she tells everyone she has legal support and knows the county officials. People just back off. I nodded slowly. That was the real strategy. Bluff loudly, act official, and bully just hard enough that nobody calls your bluff. But I wasn't just anybody, and I didn't bluff. That night, we poured a couple glasses of wine and sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The lake shimmered in shades of orange and silver, and the Mustang glowed under a motion light beside the cabin. But my mind was already 10 steps ahead. I began digging into the HOA's legal standing. Their articles of incorporation were public record filed years ago, but the last time they'd updated their operating agreement was nearly a decade back. I found no reference to anything about asset seizures, communal vehicle acquisition, or transitional turf. None of those terms existed in the official filings. Karen had made them up. My wife scrolled through Facebook on her phone and suddenly burst out laughing. "Oh my God," she said, handing me her screen. There it was, a private group called Lakeview Elite HOA Moms with a banner of a sunset and inspirational quote. And there among the top posts was Karen herself. I couldn't see the group posts without joining, but the preview showed Karen posing in front of someone's confiscated kayak with the caption, "Reclaim for community use victory." "We need in that group," I said. My wife smirked. "Already requested. I'll play nice. She'll never see it coming." We clinked glasses. It wasn't just about the Mustang anymore. It wasn't even about the cabin. This was about Karen turning a lakeside retreat into a dictatorship of fake paperwork and faux power. But the thing about people like Karen is that once they start believing their own fantasy, they stop checking for traps. And I was already setting them. The next morning began with the muffled buzz of a notification on my wife's phone, followed by the soft gasp of a woman delighted by chaos. She turned to me with an expression that could have been carved straight from a courtroom thriller and said simply, "She accepted me." Karen had approved her request to join the Lakeview Elite HOA Moms Group, a digital kingdom where dictatorship wore the mask of community engagement and condescension came dressed in Pinterest quotes. From the first post, it was clear Karen ran the group like she ran the neighborhood, aggressively with excessive punctuation and a suspicious fondness for all-caps words like mandatory and unacceptable. My wife scrolled silently, occasionally taking screenshots and handing me the phone with wide eyes. One post included a picture of our Mustang taken from behind a bush with the caption, "Non-approved vehicle still present. Surveillance necessary." Another was a selfie of Karen standing triumphantly next to someone's beached canoe with the comment claimed for HOA inventory due to lack of storage tag. Reminder, you snooze, you lose. There were posts bragging about towing a rusted swing set from someone's backyard, removing decorative flamingos under the pretense of preserving natural wildlife aesthetics, and even a draft letter she'd written to the county to rename the trailhead after herself. It was equal parts hilarious and terrifying. But one thread caught my attention more than any other. It was a long, smug post titled, "How to Handle Repeat Offenders," followed by a bullet point list that was essentially a playbook of her schemes. She detailed how to file fake violation notices, how to print interim compliance tags that looked official but weren't, and most damning of all, how to use an obscure clause from the outdated HOA charter to justify community seizure of neglected property. She even included a story about how she'd once auctioned off a neighbor's old kayak for $25 and kept the money in a community improvement reserve, which appeared to be a jar in her laundry room based on the accompanying photo. It was appalling, and it confirmed what I'd suspected from the moment she mentioned seizing my car. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Karen was running a side hustle built on fake rules, social manipulation, and the general fear most people had of legal confrontation. And now she had her sights set on my Mustang. The next piece of the puzzle came from a neighbor I hadn't expected to speak up. Alan, a quiet guy in his 50s who lived on the far end of the loop and mostly kept to himself. He approached me that afternoon while I was polishing the Mustang and offered me a beer without saying anything. We stood there for a moment before he finally said, "Saw you handle her." Most people don't. I thanked him and asked how long she'd been running her personal theft ring. He gave a bitter laugh. About 3 years. Used to be just annoying with noise complaints. But once she got herself into that board seat, it changed. Started making stuff up. Took my golf cart last summer. Claimed it was parked in a shared access lane. Sold it on Craigslist. My grip tightened on the buffer in my hand. I asked if he had proof. He nodded slowly, then said he'd find the screenshots and emails, but warned me that Karen was careful. She deletes posts fast. Uses burner email accounts. Keeps everything just fuzzy enough that folks don't bother challenging her. I told him that was about to change. That night, as my wife continued her undercover work in the Facebook group, I set up an audio recorder on my phone and casually wandered toward the trail behind the HOA office where Karen liked to take her evening power walk. I knew from watching her pattern the last 2 days that she'd be out there probably lecturing someone or dictating notes to herself. Sure enough, I found her talking to another woman, a nervous-looking mom I vaguely recognized from the block with 2 small kids. Karen was explaining how she planned to reclaim the Mustang during the next HOA compliance window. "I've already drafted the forfeiture notice," she said confidently. "Once I post it and wait the 72-hour abandonment window, it's fair game. He won't challenge it. They never do once I go legal." The other woman nodded uncomfortably, her eyes darting away. Karen continued, "I already lined up the tow. Joe from Ridgeview Hauling owes me a favor. He'll take it for next to nothing. We'll file it under seasonal enforcement." My recorder was running the entire time. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I just let her talk. The more rope she gave herself, the cleaner the hang. Back at the cabin, I uploaded the audio file and added it to a growing digital folder I labeled Operation Mustang. My wife had compiled nearly 40 screenshots by then, including one post where Karen had written, "You have to be aggressive or the non-compliance will overrun us. Assert control early." It was absurd. It was authoritarian. It was everything I needed. But the tipping point didn't come from a post or a recording. It came from a slip of the tongue. The next morning, I spotted Bryce outside again, walking with that awkward teenage overconfidence that made him look like he was trying to impersonate his mother. He had the same clipboard as before, and was photographing mailbox clusters like he was running a census. I approached him casually, leaned against the Mustang, and asked if he knew what community stewardship actually meant. He looked confused. "It means we all own everything equally," he said. "Like if you leave your car on shared land, we can use it or sell it or whatever. That's the rule." I tilted my head. "Where'd you hear that?" He shrugged. "Mom's been saying it for years. She even told me I could have a jet ski if I helped her file the stuff, right?" He grinned, clearly proud. I already picked one out. That was all I needed. I thanked him and walked back to the cabin, mind spinning. This wasn't just Karen playing HOA dictator. She was grooming her son to believe theft was compliance and bribing him with stolen goods. It was time to escalate. That evening, as the lake glowed under a gold sky, and the neighborhood settled into the quiet lull of a summer dusk, I pulled the Mustang into the garage and closed the door. Then I made a few calls. One to the county's fraud division, one to Ridgeview Hauling to confirm whether Joe had a tow scheduled, and one to an old friend from the sheriff's office who now worked county code enforcement. I didn't tell Karen anything. Let her think I'd backed off. Let her believe she'd won because the moment she made her next move, the one where she actually tried to touch the Mustang, everything would be recorded, documented, and fully actionable. I was done waiting. The trap was set, and Karen had no idea she was walking straight into it. The air on the fourth day felt different. Not in a cosmic sense, but in that subtle crackling way things do when a fuse has been lit in everyone but the arsonist knows something's about to go up in flames. Karen was quiet, too quiet. And if there's one universal rule about control freaks, it's that silence means strategy. She wasn't finished with us. Not by a long shot. And I wasn't naive enough to believe that flashing my badge had truly frightened her off. No, people like Karen didn't surrender. They recalibrated, but this time she wasn't the only one laying traps. The Mustang sat quietly in the garage now, fully secured and surrounded by cameras inside and out. The tracker was prepped, not just a GPS beacon, but a tiny high-grade motion detector that would send alerts straight to my phone the moment anyone tried to tow or tamper with it. And out by the side of the gravel drive, parked precisely where she had first seen the Mustang, was my decoy. It wasn't much to look at from up close, just a fiberglass shell made to resemble the car's rear quarter and trunk bolted to a couple of steel rods with enough faux panels to fool someone standing 20 feet away. From a distance, especially to someone with a clipboard and a vendetta, it looked authentic. It even had an expired tag and a layer of artfully placed dust to really sell the illusion. The decoy wasn't bait. It was a confession booth with a security system. I didn't tell my wife all the details, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't want her to feel any guilt when Karen inevitably took the bait. She was already doing her part deep undercover in the Lakeview Elite HOA Moms Group, which had now evolved into a daily soap opera of increasingly delusional posts. Karen had doubled down. She wrote that the Mustang was officially tagged for transitional extraction and that the board was in full agreement. There was no board meeting. Of course, no one had signed anything. In fact, 2 other members had quietly messaged my wife to say they had no idea what Karen was talking about and that they were considering stepping down if this madness didn't stop. But it didn't stop. It escalated. That afternoon, while I was working through the last of the paperwork for the formal complaint I was building, my wife stood by the front window and said very calmly, "They're back." I stood up, crossed the room, and looked through the blinds. Bryce and one of his friends were outside again, this time wearing hoodies with gloves stuffed into their pockets despite the heat. They were crouched near the gravel edge beside the decoy, whispering and pointing like 2 amateur scouts casing a warehouse. I pressed record on the camera feed and activated the backup. Mike, Bryce circled the decoy, checking for any visible VIN numbers while his friend pulled out his phone and took pictures from different angles. At one point, Bryce pulled a measuring tape from his hoodie and tried to estimate the width of the so-called shared access lane, mumbling something about compliance zones. Then the motion light kicked on, triggered by their movement, and Bryce jumped, knocking over a small solar lantern with a loud clatter. My wife and I froze watching. His friend looked spooked. Bryce, trying to save face, picked up the lantern, muttered something that sounded like, "We're good," and started walking away, but not before dropping a small yellow notice on the windshield of the decoy. After they left, I retrieved it. Another fake citation. Final warning. Vehicle subject to impoundment. Non-compliance will result in formal seizure. HOA file number 8719 alpha. I nearly laughed. The number sounded like it had been stolen from a video game. But there was nothing funny about what came next. The tow truck arrived the next morning. Not a city-commissioned vehicle, but a beat-up flatbed with Ridgeview Hauling spray-painted on the side and a dent in the bumper that looked like karma had already clipped it once. Joe, the driver, was a scruffy man with a beer gut and sunglasses too big for his face. He didn't even get out of the truck right away. He sat there for a few minutes, probably waiting for the go-ahead, until Karen emerged from the trail like a general entering a battlefield she assumed she'd already won. She pointed at the decoy, handed Joe a folder, and gestured dramatically like she was conducting a symphony. I waited just long enough for the flatbed to start lowering its ramp. Then I stepped outside. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I simply walked toward the tow truck with calm purpose, holding a clipboard of my own and the one thing Karen had never expected to face on her turf: actual authority. Joe glanced at me with mild suspicion, then turned back toward the decoy, positioning the truck for the winch. I stepped between them and raised my voice just enough to be heard over the machinery. "I'd stop that if I were you," I said. Joe frowned. "You with her?" he asked, nodding at Karen. I turned slowly, showed him my badge, and said, "Not even close. And if you touch that vehicle, you'll be participating in an unauthorized seizure under fraudulent pretenses. That's felony territory, Joe." His hand hovered over the controls like it was suddenly made of cement. Karen approached, flustered, but still performing. "He's lying," she barked. "We have authorization. The vehicle is on shared property and subject to lien." I looked her dead in the eyes. "Show me the lien." She faltered. "It's in process." I nodded. "So there is no lien?" She blinked. "It's pending." "Karen," I said evenly, "you cannot pending your way into Grand Theft Auto." Before she could reply, another set of wheels crunched across the gravel. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up behind the tow truck, lights off, but unmistakable. My son stepped out in uniform, his presence instantly shifting the air like a thunderclap. Karen's face did something incredible then, something that looked like an entire 5-act tragedy flashing behind her eyes in 2 seconds flat. She knew his face. She just hadn't known his name until now. He walked over to me first, gave me a nod, then turned to Joe. "This vehicle has a tracker," he said. "It pinged as being moved without authorization the second you activated the winch. You planning to continue?" Joe's mouth opened and closed. Then he stepped back from the truck. "I was just following orders." My son looked at Karen. "Whose orders?" She didn't speak. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I need you to explain your authority to seize this vehicle." She stared at him like her brain was rewriting its own firmware, grasping at excuses that dissolved before they reached her mouth. "I'm part of the board," she said weakly. "We have compliance discretion, but not seizure authority," my son replied. "And definitely not without a court order. You're about to walk into a legal hornet's nest if you don't walk away right now." Joe didn't wait for permission. He climbed back into the truck, muttered something into his radio, and drove off without even raising the ramp. Karen stood there, abandoned, binder in hand, speechless. I looked around at the growing crowd of neighbors who had stepped out to witness the spectacle. Some were recording, some just looked stunned, but a few were smiling. The kind of quiet, cathartic smile you see when justice takes off its coat and gets comfortable. I leaned in just enough for Karen to hear. "You just tried to steal a federal officer's property using a fake rulebook and a forged violation code." By the time the sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the road, and the dust settled, Karen had already vanished, too, leaving behind nothing but a bent clipboard in the gravel and the burnt-out silence of a woman who'd just seen the walls of her kingdom begin to buckle. It wasn't the kind of defeat that ignites a fire, but the kind that smolders into frantic desperation. That's how I knew she wasn't done. People like Karen didn't quietly slink away into the shadows after a public embarrassment. No, they doubled down in private. They plotted. They rewrote the rules even harder and found new ways to justify their behavior under layers of invented legality. And judging by the way she'd stormed off without a word, not even a threat or a huffy declaration of appeal, I knew she was going underground. She wouldn't confront us directly again. She'd send pawns. She'd move the chess pieces behind the scenes. And that's exactly what happened. The next morning, a new notice was tucked under the cabin door. Not a violation letter this time. It was labeled an emergency resolution proposal. Inside was a half-page memo printed on official-looking HOA paper with phrases like Temporary Reclamation Authority and Provisional Asset Reassessment Committee. It demanded an immediate hearing with the HOA board regarding our vehicle's alleged impact on neighborhood continuity. It was signed not by Karen but by a name I didn't recognize. Melinda Kurthers, Acting Interim Compliance Officer. I blinked at the signature. Melinda. That was Karen's bridge partner from last year. She'd once asked us to sign a petition banning glow-in-the-dark garden stones because they interrupted nocturnal animal frequencies. I turned the paper over and found nothing. No time, no date, no seal, no verification, just a demand wrapped in buzzwords that sounded important until you actually thought about them. I showed it to my wife and she immediately burst out laughing. She's delegating. That's her new play. She'll rotate people so it doesn't look like a personal grudge. And that was exactly it. Karen had realized she'd been seen, exposed, and she was trying to muddy the waters. Instead of delivering orders herself, she was going to have her loyalists step forward with fake titles and slightly altered language, hoping we'd back down or get confused. But we weren't confused. We were annoyed. And we were prepared. My wife, still logged into the Lakeview Elite HOA Moms group, noticed a flurry of new activity that morning. Karen hadn't posted anything since the confrontation, but Melinda had suddenly become very vocal. She made 3 posts within the hour, all dripping with vague insinuations about residents who defied community unity and refused to acknowledge parking statutes that had been traditionally respected. She never named us outright, but the implication was crystal clear. Other members commented in that passive-aggressive tone people use when they're scared to take sides, but still want to appear involved. One simply wrote, "I think we all know who needs to reconsider their attitude." Another said, "It's not about the car, it's about the principle." My wife screenshotted everything and sent it to our shared drive. Meanwhile, I was drafting a new document, one I knew would shake the foundation of Karen's strategy. It was a formal cease and desist letter backed by state-level HOA compliance statute. I'd already spoken with a county compliance officer who confirmed that the Lakeview HOA had no authority to impound vehicles, declare seizure zones, or create temporary enforcement positions without a board vote, a notarized resolution, and a legal filing. Karen had done none of that. Everything she'd issued was performative at best, fraudulent at worst. I typed the letter slowly, deliberately, quoting specific regulations and inserting references to civil liabilities if further action was taken against our property. I copied the HOA's legal contact just in case they wanted to intervene before this spiraled into litigation. I printed it on letterhead. I signed it and then as the final nail I added one sentence at the bottom. Please be advised that all further communications regarding this matter will be forwarded to the Department of Regulatory Oversight for formal review. That afternoon, I walked up the trail with the letter in hand, passed by a few quiet neighbors who gave me the kind of looks usually reserved for undercover agents in movies, and pinned the envelope to the HOA bulletin board just outside the office door. It was still fluttering there 20 minutes later when Karen arrived in a beige windbreaker, sunglasses, and an oversized sun hat that made her look like a spy who had read too many fashion blogs. She didn't see me watching from the trees, but I saw her. She tore the letter down, opened it, and froze. She read it twice, then a third time. Her fingers clenched the paper like she wanted to crumple it, but knew better. She looked around, expecting someone to challenge her, but no one did. There was no applause, no backup, no rallying cry, just a breeze, a rustling tree, and the mounting realization that the board she thought she controlled had become an audience watching her slip. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch, sipping coffee and listening to the wind play with the lake, my wife received a message request on Facebook. It was from a woman named Darlene, another member of the HOA Moms group. The message was brief but telling. I don't agree with what Karen's doing. She's lied to a lot of people. Just thought you should know. We thanked her. We invited her to coffee. And she brought more than just gossip. She brought documents, photocopies of older versions of the HOA charter, annotated notes from board meetings, and an email thread where Karen had instructed her to help reformat the bylaws before the upcoming spring vote. What that meant was change the language without telling anyone and claim it was always there. Karen had been retroactively editing rules, then enforcing them as if they were unanimously passed. My blood boiled. This was no longer a neighborly spat. It was organized rule fraud, a structured manipulation of language and process to coerce compliance. And now we had the receipt. The final blow of the day came not from an action, but from a whisper. That night, as we walked down to the lake with flashlights in hand, we passed by Sandra's cabin. She was out front watering her flower beds, and she looked up when she saw us. She walked over without a word, reached into her apron pocket, and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It was an internal email Karen had mistakenly CC'd to the wrong recipient. A draft of a future violation notice with my name on it. It was dated 3 days ahead. The reason? Community asset resistance and emotional disruption. I read it twice, then laughed, then folded it neatly and slid it into my folder. Karen was planning her next move even before the dust from the tow truck had cleared. But she didn't understand that this wasn't a war of notices anymore. It was a legal war now. And I wasn't just building a case. I was building a demolition team. Karen had played her hand, all of it. And I had memorized every card. The Mustang sat safe, untouched, a monument to patience and proof that even the boldest lie cracks under the weight of truth. All I had to do now was wait for her to trip over the mountain of her own paperwork. And when she did, I'd be right there to hand her the final file. The one titled Consequences. The 6th day broke with a sky so perfectly clear it might have fooled someone into believing peace had finally settled over the lake. But that illusion vanished the moment I heard the sound of tires on gravel and saw the county's official code enforcement SUV roll to a stop in front of Karen's cabin. It wasn't dramatic or loud. No sirens, no handcuffs, just the slow arrival of something long overdue. Accountability in khaki pants and mirrored sunglasses. I stayed on my porch, coffee in hand, watching from behind the wooden posts while the officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked toward Karen's front step. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see everything. Karen answered the door with a look of confident irritation, the kind she reserved for people she believed were beneath her authority. She stepped outside, her mouth already moving, probably launching into some well-rehearsed speech about community preservation and interloper misconduct, but the officer didn't nod or placate. He pointed to something in the folder he carried and kept his expression neutral. Karen's face shifted then, not to fear exactly, but to doubt, the kind that creeps in slowly when a person realizes their script isn't being followed. She crossed her arms. He shook his head. She pointed toward our cabin. He didn't turn. Instead, he handed her a notice, clipped and stamped. She took it like it was radioactive. And then he walked away just like that. I didn't move until the SUV was gone and Karen had gone back inside, slamming the door with enough force to rattle a few wind chimes on her neighbor's porch. Only then did I step back inside and check my inbox. At the top sat a scanned copy of the same document Karen had just been handed. An official cease and desist order issued by the county's Regulatory Oversight Department citing unauthorized application of HOA powers, improper issuance of fines, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property. It was exactly what I had been working toward for days, but it was only the first domino. That same afternoon, I sent out a formal complaint to the HOA's attorney, attaching all the evidence we'd compiled so far. Screenshots, video footage, fabricated bylaws, messages from neighbors, and the now infamous Facebook thread where Karen gleefully bragged about reclaiming other people's items under made-up codes. I included a recommendation for immediate suspension of her board authority pending an emergency vote. I didn't expect a fast response, but sometimes justice likes to surprise you. Within 2 hours, I received a confirmation email from the legal liaison saying the board had reviewed the materials and would be convening for a special session the next morning, not virtually, in person, and it would be open to the entire HOA. My wife and I sat in silence for a moment after reading that email. The weight of everything settling into the air like dust after a demolition. This was it. This was the moment Karen had spent years insulating herself against with fear, false authority, and forged paperwork. And now it was all going to unfold in front of the very people she'd bullied into silence. The meeting took place in the small rec hall next to the lake trail, a modest wood-paneled room that had hosted decades of bingo nights, pancake breakfasts, and seasonal HOA debates over mulch types and dock rotation schedules. But today, it felt like a courtroom. We arrived 10 minutes early, and the place was already half full. Most people sat quietly, clutching their HOA folders or glancing at each other with the kind of wary looks reserved for family reunions with unresolved drama. Karen arrived late. Of course, she did. She burst in through the side door wearing an aggressive shade of lavender and carrying her massive binder like a shield. She didn't look at me, didn't even glance in my direction, just marched straight to the front table and sat with her arms folded like a queen at a deposition. The remaining board members filtered in after her. 3 others, all of whom looked vaguely exhausted, like people who had long ago surrendered the wheel and were now realizing the bus was going over a cliff. The meeting was called to order, and then the fireworks began. The first 15 minutes were procedural roll calls, acknowledgement of the county's complaint, brief summaries of the evidence provided. Karen tried to interrupt several times, but the chairwoman, a quiet woman named Ruth, who rarely spoke above a whisper, shut her down with the firm politeness of someone who had finally found her spine. Then they opened the floor. I stood and walked forward, holding a slim folder. No theatrics, no speeches. I simply read from the list. The fake citations, the fabricated bylaws, the illegal Facebook posts, the coerced violations, the misuse of the towing company, the incident with the Mustang. I read slowly, clearly, and I didn't need to embellish anything because the truth was more damning than fiction ever could be. When I was done, I passed the folder to Ruth and returned to my seat. Karen was red-faced, muttering to herself, flipping through her binder as if the right page might save her. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a rant so scattered it bordered on incoherent claims about how she'd been trying to maintain order. How the board had abdicated their duties and left her to enforce things. How I was an outsider trying to dismantle everything she'd built. It wasn't a defense. It was a meltdown. The crowd didn't heckle her. They didn't cheer. They just sat there watching her unravel like a sweater caught on a nail. The vote was unanimous, effective immediately. Karen was suspended from all HOA duties, pending further review and a possible permanent ban. Her access to files and communication channels was revoked. Her fake citations were nullified, and the board issued a public apology to every resident who had received one of her invented fines. She didn't speak again. She left the room quietly, binder clutched to her chest like it might still have magic powers if she just held it tight enough. My wife and I stayed behind to shake hands, answer questions, and offer help to anyone else who had felt bullied or manipulated. A few neighbors even laughed about the absurdity of it all. The way Karen had once fined someone for having a bird feeder too emotionally colorful, or how she banned garden gnomes because they conflicted with HOA neutrality. It felt lighter now, freer. The fog had lifted. That night, back at the cabin, we opened a bottle of wine and sat on the porch under the stars. The Mustang parked confidently beside us like a silent witness to every battle fought and won. We didn't need to celebrate. We just breathed. The war was nearly over, but the message was just beginning to spread. Across the lake, lights turned off one by one as the neighborhood settled into peace, and somewhere in the dark, a binder full of imaginary power sat useless on a shelf, gathering dust and regret. The next morning arrived like a gentle exhale from the universe, the kind of morning that felt like it had been waiting patiently behind a storm. Sunlight poured across the cabin's deck in soft angles. The lake lay completely still except for the occasional ripple from a diving bird, and the air, for the first time in days, held no tension, no footsteps of trespassers, no false notices fluttering under the door. The Mustang, gleaming now that it was free from threat, sat like a guardian beside the cabin, not just a car anymore, but a quiet monument to resistance. Proof that truth and preparation still had weight in a world obsessed with shortcuts and appearances. We made breakfast slowly, the kind of unhurried rhythm only possible when the fight is past and the mind finally accepts safety. My wife flipped pancakes, humming softly to herself, while I sat at the counter and reviewed the final batch of messages and documents that had poured in overnight. Most of them were from residents. Some we knew, most we didn't, offering thanks, sharing stories, admitting quietly that they, too, had felt the pressure of Karen's imaginary empire. One woman confessed she'd paid over $600 in fake fines last year just to avoid confrontation. Another said she had sold her husband's canoe because Karen told her it was unapproved by the Shoreline Aesthetic Code. These weren't just stories. They were small wounds inflicted over time. Paper cuts of compliance sliced open by fear and shame. But those days were done. The best message came from Ruth, the soft-spoken board chair who had found her voice just in time. She thanked us for the evidence, told us the board was already working to revise the HOA charter with legal oversight, and extended an offer for me to join a new subcommittee focused on transparency and accountability. I read the email twice, smiled, and closed the laptop. I didn't need to be part of the board. I'd done what I came to do. Let them rebuild their own house. I just wanted my porch, my peace, and the sound of tires that didn't belong to a tow truck. My wife and I decided to take the Mustang for a long drive around the lake. Partly as a victory lap, partly because we wanted to feel the wind in our faces after so much time spent watching for shadows. The car roared to life like it had been waiting to, and we rolled past cabins and waving neighbors, past fences that no longer felt like borders and mailboxes that weren't filled with threats. We parked briefly at the overlook near the cliffside trail, and just sat in silence, holding hands, listening to the slow, patient heartbeat of summer. When we returned to the cabin later that afternoon, there was one final surprise waiting for us. A plain manila envelope sat on the porch bench. No postage, no signature, just tucked under a stone like an afterthought. I opened it cautiously, unsure whether to expect another violation or a half-baked apology. But what fell out wasn't a letter at all. It was a single sheet of paper, the original survey of our property lines, photocopied with a red circle drawn around the very gravel edge where the Mustang had been parked. Next to it, scribbled in hurried pen, were 5 words. "You were right all along." No name, no acknowledgement. But the handwriting matched the old complaint letters Karen used to drop off before she turned everything into printed drama. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe guilt, maybe shame, maybe her final way of stepping down without asking for forgiveness. Whatever it was, I folded it neatly and placed it into the folder with the rest of the evidence. Not to use it, not to archive it for future conflict, but to remember what had been built here, what had almost been taken. Around sunset, a few of the neighbors dropped by. Sandra, Alan, even Darlene from the Facebook group. They brought wine and cookies and the kind of laughter that only surfaces when shared with people who've collectively survived absurdity. We sat on the porch and swapped Karen's stories, each more ridiculous than the last. From her war against pink patio furniture to the time she threatened to find someone for whistling after 8 p.m. Each story felt lighter now, stripped of power, retold with amusement rather than dread. Someone suggested hosting an annual barbecue to replace the fall compliance inspection, and the idea took off instantly. The HOA, once a punchline and a looming presence, was slowly becoming something different, something human again. As the evening wore on and stars began to appear, a sense of closure settled over everything, not loud or theatrical, but firm and full. There would be no sequel to this mess, no last-minute reversal. Karen had been removed, exposed not by vengeance, but by fact, not through shouting, but through patience and precision. And in a world addicted to escalation, that quiet rout had felt like the truest rebellion. When everyone had left, and the night was deep and still, I stood at the edge of the porch and looked out over the lake one last time. It shimmered under the moon, reflecting a sky that had watched everything unfold and said nothing. The cabin behind me stood tall and steady, untouched by fake rules, unclaimed by self-appointed enforcers. The Mustang slept beside it, unchained, untagged, and beautifully mine. And somewhere across the lake, behind a dark window in a house that used to rule the neighborhood, a binder probably sat untouched, its pages no longer quoted, its codes no longer feared. That was the legacy Karen had built. A fragile empire of paper and bluff that collapsed the moment someone decided to read the fine print out loud. I went inside, turned off the lights, and lay beside my wife as she drifted into sleep. The silence was whole now, not heavy, not tense, just full and final. In the morning, we would pack up and drive back to the city. But this place, this cabin, this fight, it would stay with me, not as a story of conflict, but as proof that even the loudest bully folds when met with truth delivered without fear. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone tried to claim what wasn't theirs, they'd think twice before writing up a fake violation, before raising their voice in the name of imaginary laws, before forgetting that sometimes the person behind the car they're targeting carries more than keys and a title. Sometimes they carry a badge.